Today on Epic Mind Visions, I want to talk a little bit about Terence McKenna and the fact that he asked so many amazing questions. But today we live in a different time. He passed away in the year 2000 when psychedelic research was almost completely banned, while he and particularly his brother Dennis, were diving into the research around psilocybin and psychedelics in a very big way. Well, things have changed. Today, the world's top universities study psilocybin for depression. Governments, are creating legal psychedelic therapy programs. And really, with the emergence of artificial intelligence in the way that it has, it's really beginning to reshape human cognition overall. So the question in my mind isn't really whether Terence McKenna or either of the McKennas were right in any of their research or any of the questions that they posed, any of the theories that they posed. The question really becomes what happens next? And they set the foundation in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, bringing psychedelics to the human consciousness, helping evolve strategies and modalities to have access to them. And really, I think what Terence McKenna was trying to say was was that he often described these really, I guess, the advocacy of psychedelics, but just the advocacy piece of things misses the deeper point of what he was really trying to communicate at the very core. And I think at the very core of his work was a much larger idea, in that the human story is still unfolding, it's still evolving. And that is really because consciousness itself is still evolving and it's still unfolding right before us. The path is really emerging before us, and we have nothing to do but to step into it, hopefully with awareness. And he believed that the human mind couldn't be understood really as a final product, that the evolution is still in progress and still a process that's in motion. And for most of our history, humans, I think, have assumed that consciousness is fixed. That's the scientific kind of viewpoint, is believing that it's a fixed point in time, it's a fixed point in evolution, and that our way of perceiving the world is just the way things are. The reality is just the reality. But Terence really challenged that assumption by arguing that human awareness has always been shaped by the challenges and the situations and the things that have we've come up against, and that's what keeps our perception being pushed beyond ordinary limits. Because psychedelics aren't really just substances that alter the mind, they're really tools to do that. They're tools to bring us up against the boundaries of consciousness. They're flexible and allow us to expand consciousness beyond where it currently sits and what it currently means. And this is where psychedelics become really important in his philosophy, and not just as a mouthpiece for the mushrooms, if you will, but seeing them as doorways to perception. And they don't simply just create these like wild experiences or crazy insights, but they demonstrate within their use that reality as we normally perceive it is only just one real narrow potential of what our minds are capable of accessing and processing. And when we begin to remove those perceptual boundaries, even for a few hours or a few moments, people who have done these things report that they encounter new experiences, or they consider new meaning in life, new ways of understanding themselves and the world around them. And that has definitely been my reality. That's been my experience. So for Terence, that wasn't just like curiosity from a recreational standpoint. It was evidence that human consciousness still has unexplored territory. And I feel that every day because I've been a psychonaut for decades, and I feel like my mind is constantly expanding still. But it goes beyond the idea of just psychedelics themselves, in that I think Terence argued that culture is like an operating system for human perception, meaning the boundaries or cultural boundaries define how we see things. The language we use, the stories we tell and inherent from our elders, and the social systems that we build, that they really shape the reality as it appears to us. It's like the Matrix, you know? Culture determines what we think is possible, what we find as meaningful, or even what we see as visible in our own perception. And because of that, shifts in culture lead to shifts in consciousness. Kind of summarizing what his thoughts are, and when new ideas or symbols or technologies come into our awareness, they reshape our mental landscape and the way that we interpret the world around us through these new lenses that are presented to us, because we're very adaptable. Our minds and our consciousness can adapt. So if we look at it from that perspective, then the psychedelic experience, it's only one example of this larger idea or phenomenon that humans are continuously inventing new ways to alter and expand consciousness. And we see this through all of the different, not only psychedelics that humans have consumed, but art, language, spirituality, technology and science. And all of these technologies, as they develop, they push consciousness into new forms, new potential to adapt to. And I think that's why parents believe that the modern world is not just experiencing all the upheaval that we experience, but we're facing a crisis of consciousness overall, because we're doing these things based on the signals that are being posed to us. And our scientific and technological power, if you will, has grown a lot, but our ability to understand ourselves and what motivates us, our awareness, our relationship to nature and to the cosmos, has not evolved at the same pace. Although I do see an awakening, and I do have hope for that, but we just lack the clarity or the wisdom to integrate these tools into our realities in a way that is going to be more grounded instead of mismanaging them. So the central challenge really of humanity right now is not just economic or political crises, but it's psychological and it's cultural, in the sense that we need to get in touch with our consciousness. And the health of civilization depends on whether humans can do this, whether we can expand quickly enough to match these powerful technologies that we've created over the past 10, 20 years. It's been just exponential. Even in the last 12, 18 months, it's been absolutely crazy. So when we look at it this way, McKenna's thoughts and questions and legacy isn't just about psychedelics. It's about larger philosophical questions. Like, what if humanity is no longer just biological, but it's conscious? And I think that's really important, a really important distinction to make. So the real frontier then is not just somewhere out in space, where we need to go to other places. It's evolving within the human mind itself, consciousness, that allows us to even think about these things, colonizing Mars, for example, or visiting all these other planets and whatnot. It's not out there; it's in here. Is the ultimate kind of um, you know message. So when he was speaking so much around Terence, I mean the 80s and 90s, the landscape of psychedelics looked completely different than it does today. There wasn't much research. It was being shut down. The 80s, the war on drugs and all of that with Reagan era and all that. And it was a backlash to the 1960s. And, you know, the message around psychedelics were they were dangerous, irresponsible, they were fringe, you go crazy, you go dance naked in the street, like all this stuff. So there wasn't a lot of serious scientific investigation, although I think Dennis McKenna has done a lot, and especially after those years, in the last 20 years, he's done a lot. So it was really like on the margins. It kind of existed on the margins of academic and public discourse, and it wasn't taken seriously by enough people, or enough of the right people, I should say. So McKenna was speaking on that, and he was asking questions that at the time, you know, they seemed almost like, I guess, impossible in some way. And I've listened to so many of his lectures online. What role do altered states of consciousness play in the overall framework of human development? That was one of the big questions. What if psychedelics aren't just cultural accidents, but they're actually tools that were given to us to help us understand the nature of the mind? What would happen if we as a society eventually rediscovered them from that lens, looking from that lens in in being able to approach them from a more mature and thoughtful context, so that we could really try to harness what the potential of those medicines are. And it's different today. The past couple of decades, there's been a revival in really considering these substances and plants as medicines. Universities, Johns Hopkins and others, and they've reopened this research, and they've become more dedicated to understanding how psychedelic compounds affect the brain and consciousness and our own spirituality and well-being and awareness. And so scientists are studying, um, you know, psilocybin, MDMA therapy. It's really controlled and really clinical, and I'm not about that. I'm more natural, but it is what it is. And they use these like modern technologies, imaging and whatnot, so that they can really understand exactly what's scientifically happening. Whereas we know our felt experience, there's something happening, right? So they're researching the potential, and that's great. And hopefully, they're helping people with depression, addiction, traumas, and other things that we don't have solutions for. I prefer to do it more naturally, but I'm a psychonaut. Not everybody is. A lot of people, maybe most people, need some kind of structure or container. So alongside this kind of resurgence is governments and jurisdictions that are experimenting in with legal frameworks, decriminalizing, uh, making therapies more accessible and legal, and creating like a regulated framework that allows for supervised psychedelic therapy, at least. So it's still evolving, but it's really a significant shift from the war on drugs in the 80s and the blanket sort of prohibition that has defined most of my adult life. So it's just really, I think, sparked an entirely new industrial approach, with biotechnology and people pouring money into the research, and they want to they want to drugify it and bring it into a capsule and all of that stuff, and develop these therapies that, these treatments that can be thousands of dollars, and all of that. But coming from like McKenna's time, the counterculture, he was in it in the 60s and 70s. I was too young for that. So that really is starting to be hijacked by pharmaceutical development, venture capital, the health market. So it's moved from all of this underground, and where Terence gave most of his talks in sort of like these universities and back rooms and Esalen and all these things, but it's really kind of moved into the forefront, and it's happening with this backdrop of this massive like mental health crisis, right? Depression, anxiety, isolation, suicide. It's off the charts compared to what it was, and I think that's you know certainly has a lot to do with the things that McKenna was calling out about the way we live our lives. And mental health has not evolved as fast enough. A lot of the pharmaceutical drugs have caused these crises, these mental health crises, and social media and all of that. So it's really created this urgency that McKenna spoke about. Like, the time is short. We need to act now. So we're trying to catch up. Our consciousness is trying to catch up. Our policy is trying to catch up. Our tools and our therapies are trying to catch up, but it just keeps accelerating. So with artificial intelligence in particular, it's now really shaping how we as people think, and how we communicate, and how we experience information overall. Terence talked a lot about language, and the algorithms are now curating our attention. They're mediating our relationships, and they're beginning to influence how knowledge is created and shared in a big way. Not even subtly, but in very big, in-your-face ways. And that, in turn, is shaping human cognition overall, because the way we think is tied to how we interact with these artificial algorithms and artificial intelligence. So when I step back and look a little bit deeper at how these things are kind of evolving together, it becomes more clear to me is that the questions that Terence was raising years, decades ago are not just confined to this philosophical dialogue. They're really being explored now in real time in the labs, in legislature, and in boardrooms, and in clinics. And that's a huge shift from where it was back then. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we are now living out right in line with the very questions that Terence was trying to ask and answer back then. He was posing those questions, but he was ahead of his time to even be able to pose those questions, much less be able to find the answers or know the answers. So he spent most of his time, or his life really, exploring how plants and compounds affect humans, their perception of reality. His work revolved around the idea that psychedelics reveal something really fundamental about our consciousness and the nature of our consciousness, that they dissolve these mental boundaries that we all know are there. We all feel them. We may not have visceral awareness of all of them, but when they're removed in this way, it allows us to glimpse beyond to other modes of perception, other ways of thinking and interpreting the world. And these are the experiences that really consider whether, that the human mind is far more um, flexible, as I mentioned, and expansive than what we have traditionally thought was possible. And Terence was talking stating his theories at a very specific moment in history. And in 2000, the year 2000, the internet, was still very in its infantile stage. He could see it, and he talked about it. He talked about what the effects of it might be, but artificial intelligence hadn't become, even close to being this well thought out kind of uh, how it might affect humanity and consciousness. And technologies have just expanded so much to affect the way we think and the way we communicate in ways that he couldn't have foreseen, the way we process information. It's still only just the beginning, right? And the technological part of our culture that we inhabit today as a matter of course is something that he could have never foreseen. No one could have. And for me, this is raises like this really intriguing question that if psychedelics open doors into new forms of perception, then what happens when those experiences intersect with the powerful technologies that are transforming human society? So as we internalize, work with these technologies, how is our exposure to psychedelics also affecting how we interact with them? And there's all of these currents unfolding at once. The research on psychedelics, modern science that is evolving around it, neuroscientists that are studying it, how these substances affect brain networks, perception in general, the sense of self and our being, what we're doing here, who we are. And that's at the same time that consciousness has become really this more serious subject of investigation in neuroscience and philosophy and cognitive science. So in those realms, researchers are going deeper about how awareness arises, how is perception constructed, and how flexible is the human mind to adapt to those things. And that's really where we're at right now. And then, like I was saying, on the other side of that, you have artificial intelligence that is reshaping the external environment of thought. They are becoming a filter for information. They're generating language, and they're increasingly participating in creative and intellectual processes that we thought they would. I guess I always thought they would be uniquely human, making music, for example, making art, things like that, creativity, where they're influencing attention, they're influencing decision making, how we interact socially, really on every level, every single level they're affecting. And the tools that we're using to communicate and to understand what's going on in the world are evolving, exponentially, really on it every day. See something new. And that's really affecting our own cognition, our ability to have cognition or think about things in certain ways. When we see all this pulling together, there starts to be a pattern And it's really that psychedelics explore the inner frontier of consciousness, where like artificial intelligence and these digital technologies are reshaping the outside, how we interact with outside of ourselves, not necessarily internally, at least for now. We don't haven't merged with AI yet. So that's kind of really affecting the way human thought operates, and uh, the attempts to understand consciousness and the nature of awareness, and through this acceleration where we have new ideas, we have new tools, we have new cultural patterns. It's just like it's crazy to think about it. So my question is really kind of around, how does psychedelics affect these very specific interactions with technology? Because they're not, isolated from each other. They're really converging together. So I guess that means for me that the the road ahead, or the next chapter, might not just be technological, it might be chemical, biological, and meeting somewhere in the middle of these domains. And psychedelics themselves affecting human perception in ways that can shift perception in a very big way. And artificial intelligence is demonstrating that cognition can be extended beyond that internal part of ourselves, our own biological being. And neuroscience, I guess, is really showing that our sense of self and our reality is something that we construct through a lot of dynamic processes within the mind. And again, just kind of thinking about how to bring all these ideas and things together, that it really suggests that humanity is approaching another transformation in how consciousness is understood, and how ultimately it's experienced by the individual. And I think that's really exciting, and it can be scary too, you know? So if that's true, then the conversations that McKenna began all these decades ago, they're not finished, right? The questions he raised about perception, about culture, about the nature of awareness, they're just entering an entirely new phase, or chapter that won't be written just by psychedelics or just by technology, but how these two things evolve together. Well, really, psychedelics, technology, and consciousness, and the relationship between all of those things together, and with the tools that we've already created and the ones that we cannot foresee. And that is really unfolding in real time. And it's the frontier that we're starting to explore, you know? So I'm really fascinated by uh, Terence. I have been for years and years and years, and listened to him, but I've never been able to bring ideas together about what he said versus where we're at versus where we're going. A lot of things he said were very um, poignant at the time. But today we're really surrounded by technologies that are changing how we think in ways that it's not just the technology like the medicine. They're changing all of these things, language, and our communication, and ultimately how we experience reality. So the real question here isn't whether psychedelics specifically are important. The real question here is more about what is happening, what's happening to human consciousness, how it's evolving right now, with not only our access to the tools of the medicines, but with our access to the technology tools that are around us. So I'm just riffing here on Terence, the ideas that he planted into the human consciousness decades ago, and honoring his work and how he explored them and exposed them to so many people. So if you're interested in talking and thinking more about these issues, drop your comment in the comment section, subscribe, like, and we'll see you on the next video. Take care. Peace.